A ruthless MMA fighter punches a 14-year-old kid in sparring, breaking his nose and laughing as blood splatters across the mat. The sadistic bully kicks the fallen child, calling it training, while other kids watch in terror. But the quiet janitor, mopping floors in the corner, isn't just another maintenance worker. This is Mike Tyson himself. The MMA fighter has no idea he just tortured a child in front of the most feared puncher in boxing history. While the bully threatens more violence, the former heavyweight champion steps onto the mat with deadly calm. The arrogant fighter thinks he's about to school an old man, but he's actually facing a legend who spent decades destroying anyone who hurt the innocent. The kids recognize their savior and step back, knowing justice is about to be served with iron fists. What happens when you pick the wrong fight in front of the wrong janitor? Will the MMA bully survive learning why some champions never fade? What happened next would terrorize the fighter for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside Community Center, casting long shadows across the worn boxing ring, where 14-year-old Danny Martinez adjusted his headgear for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation that always coursed through him when he stepped between the ropes. Around the gym, kids jumped rope, pounded heavy bags, and sprawled at corner tables working through homework assignments. The familiar sounds of training filled the air, the rhythmic thump of gloves against leather, the squeak of sneakers on canvas, the encouraging shouts of teammates. "All right, beginners," Brick Kowalski's voice boomed across the gym as he pulled on sparring gloves. At 28, he stood 6'4" and carried himself with the fluid confidence of a man who had never met physical opposition he couldn't overcome. His blonde hair was cropped military short, and expensive Under Armour gear stretched tight across his muscled frame. Time for some real education. Danny's stomach tightened as Brick's cold blue eyes fixed on him. The man's smile never reached those eyes. It was all teeth and calculation. "Martinez, you're up first," Brick announced, flexing his shoulders. "Gonna show everyone proper defensive positioning." The other kids gathered around the ring's perimeter, their conversations dying to whispers. Danny had been training here for 3 months, long enough to recognize the dangerous shift in Brick's tone. This wasn't going to be instruction. This was going to be punishment disguised as education. "Remember, son," Brick said as Danny approached the center of the ring. "In real boxing, you gotta learn to take punishment before you can dish it out." The first punch came without warning, a sharp jab that snapped Danny's head back despite his raised guard. The second followed immediately, a hook that slipped around his gloves and caught him flush on the temple. Danny staggered but kept his feet, the metallic taste of blood already coating his tongue. "See that footwork?" Brick called to the watching kids while landing another combination. Kids learning to dance. From his position near the equipment room, a quiet maintenance worker emerged from the shadows. Mike's name tag identified him simply as facility staff, but his hands gripped the mop handle with white-knuckle intensity as he watched the systematic destruction taking place in the ring. At 57, he'd learned to make himself invisible, to observe without being observed. But something about the deliberate cruelty unfolding before him made his jaw clench. The sickening crack of Danny's nose breaking echoed through the suddenly silent gym. Blood sprayed across the canvas as the boy dropped to one knee, both hands instinctively covering his face. Dark red droplets stained the white mat like scattered rose petals. "You had enough, Martinez?" Brick asked, standing over the wounded boy. "Were you ready to learn what real boxing feels like?" Danny struggled to his feet, blood streaming between his fingers. "I'm ready," he whispered through damaged cartilage. Near the equipment room, Mike's internal voice spoke with deadly calm. "Not again. Not on my watch." The gym emptied with unusual speed after the session ended, kids gathering their gear and hurrying toward the exit without their typical post-training chatter. Only Mike and Tommy Sullivan remained as the late afternoon light faded through the tall windows. Mike moved across the floor with methodical precision, his mop cutting clean paths through the day's accumulated sweat and chalk dust. Tommy watched the janitor work, noting the obvious reverence in his movements. In 6 months of employment, Mike had never once complained about staying late or cleaning up after particularly brutal training sessions. There was something almost ritualistic about how he cared for the equipment, straightening gloves on there. Hooks, ensuring jump ropes hung at precise intervals, wiping down each piece of apparatus with gentle attention. "Thanks for staying late again, Mike," Tommy said, his weathered face showing the strain of the day's events. At 67, the former Golden Gloves boxer had seen enough violence to recognize the difference between training and abuse. "You've been a godsend since you started here." Mike paused near the ring, crouching to retrieve something from beneath the bottom rope. Danny's mouthguard lay there, cracked and stained with blood. He picked it up with surprising gentleness, examining the damage with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of protective equipment. "Mind if I clean this up?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Tommy replied, settling onto the ring apron. "You ever box yourself, Mike? You handle that gear like you know what it's for." Mike carried the mouthguard to the small sink near the equipment room, running warm water over the plastic. His movements were precise, practiced, the hands of someone who had cleaned countless mouthguards over the years. "A little, back in the day," he said without looking up. "Nothing serious." Tommy's experienced eyes caught something in Mike's technique, the way he tested the fit, checked for stress fractures, examined the bite marks. "I did some fighting myself," Tommy offered. "Golden Gloves in the 70s. Different world then. Trainers actually cared about their fighters." "Different world," Mike agreed, placing the clean mouthguard carefully on the equipment table where Danny would find it tomorrow. His voice carried a weight that spoke of understanding earned through experience rather than observation. The two men worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, Mike completing his cleaning routine while Tommy organized paperwork. There was an unspoken connection between them. Two men who had lived long enough to recognize something broken in what they'd witnessed. As Mike gathered his supplies and prepared to lock up, Tommy's voice broke the quiet. "Tomorrow's Wednesday," he said, not meeting Mike's eyes. "Brick runs his advanced class. Things tend to get more intense." Mike nodded grimly, shouldering his supply cart. He walked toward the exit with measured steps, but Tommy noticed something different in his posture, a tension that hadn't been there that morning. "Have a good evening, Mike," Tommy called. Mike paused at the door, his hand on the light switch. For a moment, Tommy thought he might say something more, but instead he simply nodded and stepped into the night. Through the window, Tommy watched him walk to an old pickup truck where he sat motionless for several minutes before starting the engine and driving away. Danny pushed through the front door of the modest apartment, trying to minimize his limp as he navigated the narrow hallway. The familiar sound of computer keys clicking greeted him, his mother's steady rhythm as she worked through another batch of medical transcription files. Elena Martinez sat at the kitchen table in her wheelchair, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, reading glasses perched on her nose as she converted doctors' recorded notes into typed reports. "How was school, Mijo?" she asked without looking up from her laptop screen, though Danny caught the slight pause in her typing that meant she was paying attention. "Fine," he replied, angling his face away from the light as he headed toward the refrigerator. "Just tired from gym class." Elena's trained medical, I didn't miss the careful way he moved or the slight swelling around his nose. 2 years in a wheelchair hadn't diminished her ability to read the signs of injury, but she'd learned to balance her protective instincts against her son's growing need for independence. At 14, Danny was becoming the man of their small household, and she couldn't mother him like the child he'd been before the accident changed everything. The car crash that ended her nursing career played through her mind in fragments. The intersection, the other driver running the red light, the moment she knew her legs would never work again. Danny had been 12 then, forced to grow up overnight as medical bills consumed their savings, and his father decided he couldn't handle life with a disabled wife. Now Elena earned barely enough through transcription work to cover rent and groceries, while Danny's part-time job at Murphy's Market helped with the basics. "Your mouthguard looks cleaner than usual," Elena observed as Danny retrieved it from his backpack. The clear plastic gleamed under the kitchen light, free of the usual stains and scratches. "Yeah, the gym got some new cleaning stuff," Danny lied smoothly, though something warm flickered in his chest at the thought of someone caring enough to restore his equipment properly. "One of the staff guys is really thorough about maintenance." Elena nodded, returning to her typing. She'd grown to appreciate the community center, not just for the free after-school program, but for the way it gave Danny purpose and hope. Boxing wasn't her first choice for her son's activities, but she understood his need to feel strong in a world that had taken so much from their family. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Danny stared at a crumpled flyer he'd pulled from the gym's bulletin board. Amateur boxing tournament, November 15th, $500 first prize. $500 could pay for his mother's physical therapy sessions, maybe even cover the specialist appointment her doctor had recommended, but they couldn't afford. He slipped out of bed and stood in the small space between his dresser and window, shadowboxing in the dim light from the street lamp outside. Each movement sent sharp pain through his damaged nose, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the combinations Tommy had shown him months ago, back when he thought training meant learning technique rather than surviving punishment that I can take. Whatever Brick dishes out, Danny told himself, practicing a slip-and counter combination in slow motion. Mom needs that money, and this is the only way I'm going to get it. His reflection in the dark window showed a thin boy with two old eyes, but Danny saw something else, a fighter who wouldn't quit, no matter how much it hurt. Tomorrow he'd face Brick again, and the day after that, and every day until he was strong enough to win that tournament and change their lives forever. Frank Kowalski's black Escalade pulled into the community center parking lot at precisely 8 o'clock Wednesday morning, its polished chrome gleaming in the early sunlight. At 58, Frank carried himself with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his tailored business suit suggested someone more comfortable in boardrooms than gymnasiums. Tommy Sullivan watched through his office window as Frank approached, knowing the monthly ritual by heart. The construction magnate would write another check, ask pointed questions about his son's training methods, and expect reassurance that his investment was producing results. What Tommy couldn't tell him was that those results were becoming increasingly difficult to watch. "Morning, Tommy," Frank said, settling into the chair across from the director's desk. He pulled out a leather checkbook and began writing with practiced efficiency. "How's my boy doing with the program?" "Brick's certainly making an impression on the kids," Tommy replied carefully, accepting the check for $5,000. The amount would keep the center operating for another month, funding everything from equipment maintenance to after-school snacks. Frank's expression brightened with paternal pride. "That's what I like to hear. Boy's got a gift for training, knows how to separate the wheat from the chaff. These kids today, they're too soft. Need someone who'll teach them the world doesn't hand out participation trophies." Some of the younger ones might be having trouble adjusting to his intensity, Tommy ventured, thinking of Danny's bloody nose and the fear he'd seen in other children's eyes. "Good." Frank slammed his palm on the desk for emphasis. "Better they learn it here in a controlled environment than get blindsided by reality later. Brick's doing them a favor, teaching them resilience." Mike appeared in the doorway, pushing his supply cart. His janitor's uniform was spotless, his movements efficient and unobtrusive as he began emptying the wastebasket beside Tommy's desk. Frank barely glanced at him. Help was invisible to men like Frank Kowalski. "I've been thinking," Frank continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Channel 7 wants to do a feature story on community youth programs. Might be good publicity for the center, show people what their donations are supporting. Brick's got some special training techniques he's been wanting to try with the more promising kids." Mike's movements slowed imperceptibly as he transferred papers from the waste bin to his cart. His jaw tightened, but his expression remained neutral. "What kind of techniques?" Tommy asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Advanced conditioning methods. Sparring scenarios that really test a kid's heart. The kind of training that separates future champions from weekend warriors." Frank's smile held no warmth. "Trust me, Tommy. I know what it takes to build winners." Mike finished with the trash and moved toward the door, but Frank's next words stopped him cold. "Matter of fact, I'm bringing some associates by next week to watch Brick work with the kids. Potential investors who understand the value of proper youth development." Frank's tone suggested these weren't the kind of investors who appeared in community center brochures. After Frank left, the office fell silent except for the distant sounds of kids arriving for the day's first activities. Tommy shuffled through paperwork, trying to ignore the way Mike lingered near the doorway. When he finally looked up, Their eyes met across the small room. Mike had taken an unusually long time emptying one trash can. His dark eyes held an intensity that made Tommy suddenly uncomfortable, as if the quiet janitor had heard and understood. Far more than he was supposed to. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Mike nodded once and walked away, leaving Tommy with the unsettling feeling that something significant had just shifted in the careful balance of their small world. Wednesday afternoon arrived with the weight of inevitability. Danny stepped through the community center doors at 4 o'clock sharp, his nose still tender from yesterday's encounter, but his resolve unshaken. The advanced class was smaller. Only 6 kids brave enough or desperate enough to endure Brick's intensive training methods. Brick stood in the center of the ring like a predator surveying his territory, expensive athletic gear stretched across his muscled frame. His cold blue eyes swept over the assembled teenagers with calculated interest, lingering on Danny's swollen features with obvious satisfaction. "Today we're doing conditioning exercises," Brick announced, his voice carrying the false enthusiasm of a teacher hiding cruelty behind pedagogy. "Real fighters need to overcome adversity. So we're going to practice with some mismatched sparring." Danny's stomach dropped as Brick's gaze fixed on him. "Martinez, you're up first. Marcus, get your gear on." Marcus' chin stood 6 inches taller than Danny and outweighed him by 40 pounds. The 15-year-old was one of Brick's legitimate prospects, a kid with natural talent who received actual instruction instead of systematic abuse. Marcus shot Danny an apologetic look as he pulled on his headgear, understanding the ugly dynamic but powerless to change it. The first round proceeded as expected. Marcus tried to go easy, but Brick's constant shouting forced him to increase his aggression. Danny absorbed punishment with grim determination, using every defensive technique Tommy had taught him months ago when training still meant learning instead of surviving. "Stop!" Brick's voice cracked like a whip. He climbed through the ropes and approached Danny, who was breathing hard but still standing. "Your guard's all wrong, Martinez. Let me show you proper technique." The first corrective punch caught Danny in the ribs with surgical precision, hard enough to drive the air from his lungs, placed specifically to cause maximum pain without visible damage. The second landed on his shoulder, the third on his opposite side. Each blow was delivered with clinical detachment, as if Brick were adjusting equipment rather than assaulting a child. "See how I'm targeting the body?" Brick called to the watching kids. "Builds toughness." Danny staggered but refused to fall. When the next punch doubled him over, Brick's foot caught him in the ribs, sending him crashing to the canvas. "Don't fake injuries, Martinez. Get up and take it like a man." As Danny struggled to his feet, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, a quiet voice spoke from the ring's edge. "Everything all right in here?" Mike stood in the doorway, mop in one hand, his dark eyes taking in the scene with careful intensity. His janitor's uniform seemed somehow different, less servile, more purposeful. That Brick's laugh held genuine malice. "Just fine, janitor. Mind your own business and stick to mopping floors." He gestured dismissively. "This is training, not housekeeping." Mike's grip tightened on the mop handle as Danny wiped blood from his mouth and said, "I'm ready to continue." Something shifted in Mike's expression, a spark of the old fire that had once made him the most feared man in boxing. The gym fell silent except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the soft shuffle of nervous feet. Mike stood motionless in the doorway for several heartbeats, watching Danny prepare to absorb more punishment with the quiet dignity of someone far too young to understand such cruelty. "Maybe the boy needs a proper demonstration of technique," Mike said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn toward him. Brick's laughter echoed off the concrete walls. "What? From you?" He gestured at Mike's uniform with obvious disdain. "Old man, you don't know what you're getting into here. This is professional training, not amateur hour." Mike stepped fully into the gym, setting his mop aside with deliberate care. "Tommy," he called to the director, who had emerged from his office at the sound of raised voices. "You got spare gloves I could borrow?" Tommy hesitated, his experienced eyes catching something in Mike's posture that made him suddenly alert. The janitor's movements had changed, less shuffling servitude, more fluid purpose. Sure, Mike. 16-ounce okay." "Perfect," Mike replied, beginning to unbutton his work shirt. Brick stripped down to his workout gear, still chuckling at what he perceived as an old man's delusion. "This is going to be educational," he told the kids gathered around the ring. "Watch what happens when someone who doesn't know their place tries to step up." But as Mike removed his janitor's shirt, the atmosphere in the room shifted like pressure dropping before a storm. His torso revealed the body of someone who had once been incredibly dangerous, scars mapping old battles, tattoos telling stories of a harder life, muscles that age had softened but not destroyed. This wasn't the physique of a maintenance worker. The kids exchanged uncertain glances. Even Marcus, who had been preparing to leave the ring, stopped to stare. Something about the way Mike moved, testing his shoulder rotation, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet, suggested depths of experience none of them had suspected. Tommy approached with the gloves, his weathered face troubled. As he helped Mike lace up, he whispered, "You sure about this?" Mike flexed his fingers inside the leather, muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. "Been sure about a lot of things in my life," he replied quietly. "This is one of them." Brick bounced, on his toes in the center of the ring, shadowboxing for the benefit of his audience. At 28, he was in peak physical condition, 6'4" of trained muscle and aggressive confidence. The contrast between him and the older, smaller man pulling on gloves beside the ring seemed almost comical. "What's your name, son?" Mike asked as he stepped through the ropes. "Brick Kowalski," came the dismissive reply. "And you're about to learn why I'm the teacher and you're the help." Mike nodded once, settling into a fighter's stance that seemed as natural as breathing. His movements were economical, precise, the accumulated wisdom of decades spent in combat. "Mine's Mike," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent gym. "Mike Tyson." The name hung in the air like a thunderclap, and every person in the room suddenly understood they were about to witness something extraordinary. The revelation rippled through the gym like electricity. Danny's mouth fell open, Marcus backed against the ropes, and Tommy's face went pale as he realized what was about to happen. Even Brick's confident smirk faltered for a moment before reasserting itself. "Right," Brick scoffed, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "And I'm Muhammad Ali." Mike said nothing, simply raising his gloves and settling into the classic Tyson stance, a low crouch that made his already compact frame seem to coil like a loaded spring. His head moved in the subtle weaving motion that had once made him untouchable, and suddenly the years seemed to fall away. Brick came forward aggressively, throwing a wild right hand designed to end the fight immediately. It was the punch of someone who relied on size and strength rather than technique. Telegraphed, overpowered, and fatally slow. Mike slipped the punch with liquid grace, his head moving just enough to let the fist whistle past his ear. The movement was so effortless it seemed almost accidental, until Brick threw another haymaker and Mike avoided it with the same impossible ease. "Jesus," Tommy whispered, recognizing the textbook perfection of the defensive work. For 2 minutes, Mike simply moved, slipping punches, rolling with attempted combinations, occasionally tapping Brick lightly with his gloves. Not hitting, just touching, showing complete control, while Brick grew increasingly frustrated and wild. The younger man's breathing became labored as he threw power shot after power shot into empty air. Then Brick made his fatal mistake. Angry and embarrassed, he loaded up with a massive overhand right, putting every ounce of his strength behind. A punch meant to separate Mike's head from his shoulders. Mike saw it coming from the moment Brick's weight shifted. He slipped left, stepped inside the arc of the punch, and drove a short right hand into Brick's solar plexus, a perfect body shot that landed with surgical precision. The sound was unmistakable, the wet thud of leather meeting flesh, followed immediately by Brick's explosive exhale as every molecule of air left his lungs. He doubled over, gasping, his face rapidly turning red as his diaphragm spasmed. Mike didn't celebrate or gloat. He simply stepped back and waited, gloves still raised, as professional as a metronome. When Brick straightened up, his eyes now wide with real fear, Mike nodded once and moved forward. The combination that followed was pure vintage Tyson. A left uppercut to the body that lifted Brick onto his toes, followed immediately by a right hand to the same spot that dropped him to his knees. Each punch was placed with mathematical precision, designed to maximize impact while maintaining perfect control. Brick knelt on the canvas, hands pressed to his midsection, making small gasping sounds as he struggled to breathe. His face had gone from red to white, and sweat poured down his forehead despite the gym's cool temperature. Mike removed his gloves and extended a hand to help his opponent up. "That's how you teach technique without breaking spirits," he said, quietly. Before Brick could respond, Frank Kowalski's voice boomed from the gym entrance. "What the hell is going on here?" Frank stormed across the gym floor, his expensive shoes slapping against the rubber mats as he rushed to his son's aid. Brick was still on his knees, gulping air like a drowning man, his earlier arrogance replaced by shell-shocked confusion. "Dad," Brick wheezed, accepting his father's help to stand. "The old man, he's not what we thought." Frank's face flushed crimson as he rounded on Tommy. "I want explanations, and I want them now. What kind of operation are you running here?" "My lawyers will shut this place down before, Mr. Kowalski," Mike interrupted, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone turn toward him. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." Frank's eyes narrowed as he took in Mike's appearance. The janitor's uniform, the obvious conditioning, the complete lack of deference. "And who exactly are you?" "Mike Tyson," Mike replied simply, extending his hand. "I believe we need to talk." 10 minutes later, the three men sat in Tommy's cramped office while the kids waited nervously in the main gym. Frank had regained his composure, but his calculating eyes suggested a man rapidly reassessing the situation. "Let me be clear about something, Mr. Tyson," Frank began, leaning forward in his chair. "This community center exists because I fund it. My son's training methods might seem harsh, but they produce results." "What kind of results?" Mike asked quietly, but Frank's smile was cold. "The kind that separate the wheat from the chaff. See, most of these kids will never amount to anything. But a few, the ones with real heart, they can serve a purpose." Tommy shifted uncomfortably as Frank continued, his voice taking on a businessman's practiced cadence. "There's a significant market for live entertainment in this city. Underground venues where people pay premium prices to watch authentic competition. The kids who can handle Brick's training, who show real potential, they get legitimate opportunities. Scholarships, proper coaching, maybe even professional contracts." Mike's expression remained neutral. "And the others?" "The others learn valuable life lessons about resilience and disappointment." Frank's tone suggested he was discussing livestock rather than children. "Sometimes that education takes place in more challenging environments. But they're compensated fairly for their participation." The truth hit Mike like a physical blow. "You're feeding kids to underground fights." "I'm providing opportunities for young people to earn money and learn about themselves," Frank corrected. "Everything's voluntary, everything's documented. These kids sign up knowing what they're getting into." Mike looked at Tommy, who couldn't meet his eyes. "And if I walk away right now? Forget everything I've heard." Frank's smile widened. "Then, tomorrow morning, the insurance gets renewed, the permits get approved, and 60 kids keep having a safe place to go after school. Everyone wins. And if I don't?" Frank's expression hardened. "Then tomorrow afternoon, there's no community center. No programs, no safe space, no hope for any of these kids. Sometimes buildings have accidents, Mr. Tyson. Sometimes people get hurt when they're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Mike stared out the office window at Danny and the other children, still gathered near the ring, talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed. Their faces glowed with hope and admiration, emotions that would be extinguished forever if this place disappeared. "I'll stay," Mike said finally. "But things are going to change around here." Frank's laugh was genuinely amused. "No, Mr. Tyson, they're not." Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of October dawn that promised winter wasn't far away. Mike used his key to let himself into the community center at 6 a.m., 2 hours before the first staff members would arrive. The empty gym felt different in the pre-dawn silence, larger somehow, filled with shadows that seemed to hold secrets. Moving with purpose, Mike began his investigation in Tommy's office. The file cabinets weren't locked, suggesting either supreme confidence or dangerous carelessness on Frank's part. Inside the second drawer, beneath routine administrative paperwork, Mike found what he was looking for. Medical waivers disguised as training consent forms contain language that would make any parent's blood run cold. Participant acknowledges inherent risks of intensive conditioning programs, and guardian releases facility from liability for injuries sustained during advanced sparring scenarios. The forms were signed by parents who clearly had no idea what they were actually authorizing. Deeper in the files, Mike discovered financial records showing payments to something called Riverside Entertainment Contractors in amounts that dwarfed the center's legitimate operating budget. A calendar marked with cryptic notations showed events scheduled every other Saturday night at various warehouse locations around the city, but the most damning evidence lay behind a false wall in the equipment storage room. Mike discovered the hidden space by accident, noticing that the room seemed smaller inside than its external dimensions suggested. A section of drywall gave way under pressure, revealing a narrow chamber containing professional filming equipment, medical supplies, and photographs that made his stomach turn. The pictures showed kids he recognized, former center participants who had supposedly moved away or lost interest in the program. But these photos captured them in underground fighting venues, some barely conscious, others clearly drugged, all bearing injuries that spoke of systematic brutality. That a loose leaf binder contained detailed profiles, family situations, financial pressures, psychological vulnerabilities. Danny's name appeared on a list titled Primary Candidates, November Selections. The clinical precision of the documentation revealed an operation far more sophisticated than Mike had imagined. The sound of keys in the front door made Mike quickly photograph several pages with his phone before carefully replacing everything. He was back at his supply cart, mopping near the office, when Tommy arrived. "Morning, Mike," Tommy called, then stopped abruptly. Something in Mike's expression made the older man's face go pale. "What's wrong?" Mike gestured toward the office. "We need to talk." 20 minutes later, Tommy sat behind his desk with his head in his hands, his confessions spilling out in broken sentences. Frank had leveraged old gambling debts to force his cooperation, threatening to destroy not just Tommy, but his daughter's family if he refused to participate. "I never wanted this," Tommy whispered. "But they made it clear. Either I help identify vulnerable kids, or they'd find another way to get what they wanted. At least this way, I could try to protect some of them." Mike placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. "How many kids have they taken?" 15, maybe 20 over the past 2 years. They always make it look voluntary, offer money, promise opportunities. By the time the kids realize what's really happening, Tommy's voice trailed off, but Mike understood. By then, it was too late. Thursday afternoon found Mike watching Brick's regular session with new eyes, seeing patterns that had been invisible before. The legitimate prospects, kids like Marcus with obvious talent and stable home situations, received actual instruction. They learned proper technique, got constructive feedback, even occasional praise when they performed well, but the vulnerable ones were handled differently. Brick isolated them during training, breaking down their confidence while building dependence. On his approval, he identified which kids were desperate enough to accept increasingly dangerous opportunities, mapping their psychological weaknesses with predatory precision. As the session ended, Mike began documenting everything on his phone. He photographed the training schedules that showed which kids were grouped together, recorded Brick's conversations about special opportunities for dedicated students, and noted which children showed signs of the systematic conditioning he now recognized. During his official cleaning time, Mike implemented his own counter-programming. As kids finished homework at corner tables, he quietly approached the most vulnerable ones, ostensibly checking if they needed fresh water or snacks. "Danny," he said, approaching the boy who was struggling with algebra while nursing bruised ribs. "Your stance yesterday. You're dropping your left shoulder when you jab. Want me to show you something?" For the next 20 minutes, Mike taught real boxing fundamentals to Danny and 3 other at-risk kids. He showed them how to maintain proper guard position, how to generate power from their legs rather than just their arms, and most importantly, how to defend themselves effectively. "Boxing isn't about taking punishment," Mike explained, guiding Danny through a basic slip-in counter combination. "It's about using your brain to stay safe while you work." The transformation was immediate. With proper instruction, Danny's movements became smoother, more confident. The other kids, Joey, Marcus, and a 13-year-old girl named Lisa, absorbed the lessons eagerly, finally experiencing what real training felt like. Between instruction sessions, Mike used his maintenance access to install tiny cameras in strategic locations. The devices, purchased that morning from an electronics store, were designed for home security but perfect for documenting illegal activities. He placed them to capture the ring area, Brick's private office, and the entrance to the hidden room.as. The afternoon wound down. Mike stepped outside to make a crucial phone call. Detective Raymond Carter had been his friend since the early days of Mike's boxing career, back when young fighters needed someone they could trust in the police department. "Ray, it's Mike Tyson. I need to meet with you tomorrow morning. I've got something that's going to make your year, but we need to do this right." Carter's voice carried the weariness of a 20-year veteran. "Mike? Christ, I haven't heard from you in years. What kind of trouble you in?" "Not my trouble this time," Mike replied, watching through the window as Danny packed up his homework. "But there's kids involved, and it's bad. Real bad." They arranged to meet at Murphy's Diner the next morning at 7 a.m., away from official channels until Mike could lay out the evidence properly. As Mike returned to the gym, he found Brick waiting near his supply cart, flanked by two men Mike didn't recognize. The MMA fighter's eyes held a dangerous glint. "Interesting conversation, janitor," Brick said quietly. "Hope you're not getting any ideas above your station." Mike met his stare without flinching. "Just arranging some equipment maintenance. Gonna be a busy weekend." Friday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Danny arrived at the community center before official hours, finding Mike already setting up equipment in the small training room adjacent to the main gym. The older man moved with obvious purpose, arranging heavy bags and speed bags with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times. "You're early," Mike observed, noting the eager anticipation in Danny's movements. "Couldn't sleep," Danny admitted. "Been thinking about what you showed me yesterday. About real boxing." Mike smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Danny had seen from him. "Get your gear. Bring Marcus, Joey, and Lisa if they're here. Time for some actual education." For the next 90 minutes, Mike conducted a masterclass in boxing fundamentals that erased years of Brick's destructive programming. He taught them footwork that made them mobile rather than stationary targets, defensive techniques that protected rather than absorbed punishment, and most importantly, the mental aspects of the sport. "Boxing is chess, not checkers," Mike explained, demonstrating how to set up combinations 3 moves in advance. "Your brain is your best weapon. Your heart keeps you fighting when your body wants to quit. But technique keeps you safe." He shared carefully edited stories from his own career, emphasizing lessons about discipline, learning from defeat, and the responsibility that came with strength. "Real fighters protect people who can't protect themselves. Anyone can hurt someone weaker. Takes a true champion to make them stronger." The kids absorbed every word, their confidence growing visibly with each lesson. Danny's movements became fluid and natural, his punches carrying real power generated from proper form rather than desperate aggression. Marcus, who had been conflicted about his role in Brick's sessions, found himself understanding boxing as an art rather than a weapon. Lisa, smallest of the group at 13, discovered that speed and intelligence could overcome size disadvantages. "My grandfather always said the best fighters aren't the biggest," Mike told her as she mastered a slip-in counter combination. "They're the smartest." As the session neared its end, Mike gathered the 4 kids around him. "What I'm teaching you isn't just about boxing. It's about respect for yourselves, for others, for the sport. Real strength doesn't come from hurting people who can't fight back." The sound of the main gym door opening announced Brick's early arrival. Mike quickly had the kids put away their equipment and scatter to their usual morning activities, but Brick's suspicious expression suggested he'd noticed something different. "Starting early today, janitor?" Brick asked, his voice carrying an edge of menace. "Just getting things ready for your session," Mike replied neutrally. Kids seemed eager to train. Brick studied the group of kids now sitting at tables working on homework, noting their relaxed demeanor and the subtle confidence in their postures. Something had changed, and he didn't like it. "Well, since everyone's so eager," Brick announced loudly, "we'll have a special assessment next week. Each of you gets to demonstrate your progress in front of some very important visitors." Mike's jaw tightened as he recognized the words for what they were: a selection process for the underground fights. "Should be very educational," Brick continued, his cold smile fixed on Danny. "We'll see who's really ready for advanced opportunities." As Brick walked toward his office, Mike caught Danny's eye and nodded once. The boy's return nod carried new understanding. Whatever was coming, He wouldn't face it alone. Murphy's Diner sat on the edge of downtown, the kind of place where cops grabbed coffee at shift change and construction workers fueled up before dawn. Detective Raymond Carter occupied a corner booth, his weathered face showing every one of his 53 years as he reviewed the evidence Mike had laid before him. "Jesus Christ, Mike," Carter whispered, studying photographs of the underground fighting venues on his tablet. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 2 years, maybe longer," Mike replied, keeping his voice low despite the early morning. Crowds and attention. Frank Kowalski's been using the community center as a recruiting ground. Legitimate prospects get real training and opportunities. The vulnerable kids. He gestured at the financial records. They become commodities. Carter's expression hardened as he reviewed bank statements showing payments to offshore accounts, medical waivers that would never hold up in court, and most damning, video footage from Mike's hidden cameras showing Brick's systematic abuse. "We've had Kowalski Construction under investigation for money laundering," Carter admitted. "But this is federal territory. Human trafficking, organized racketeering, child endangerment. The Bureau's going to want to take point." Mike leaned forward. "There's an event tomorrow night. Calendar shows it's a big one. They've been conditioning kids for weeks." "You sure about the location?" "Warehouse District, Building 47 on Riverside. Same place they've used twice before." Mike's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd done his homework thoroughly. "The kids on the selection list will be told it's a showcase for college scouts. By the time they realize what's really happening," Carter nodded grimly. "We'll coordinate with federal agents, set up surveillance, maybe get you wired for sound if you're willing to go undercover." "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to stop this." An hour later, Mike returned to the community center wearing a concealed recording device provided by Carter's technical team. The tiny microphone was virtually undetectable, designed for deep undercover work and capable of broadcasting to receivers within a half-mile radius. The afternoon session proceeded normally on the surface, but Mike watched everything with new understanding. Brick's seemingly casual conversations with parents took on sinister meaning when viewed through the lens of systematic grooming. His encouragement of certain kids to push through the pain wasn't motivation, it was conditioning. As parents picked up their children, Mike overheard Brick speaking to Elena Martinez about Danny's exceptional potential and his special opportunity coming up soon. The boy's mother smiled gratefully, having no idea her son was being recruited for underground fights that could leave him permanently disabled or worse. When the gym finally emptied, Tommy approached Mike near the equipment room. "You sure about this plan?" the older man asked, glancing nervously toward Brick's office. "Been sure about a lot of things in my life," Mike replied, echoing his words from the previous day. "This is one of them." Saturday morning would bring the final preparation phase. Federal agents would establish surveillance positions around the warehouse while Mike gathered last-minute intelligence from inside the operation. The recording equipment would capture evidence for prosecution, but more importantly, it would provide real-time intelligence to coordinate the rescue of any children already at the venue. Mike locked up the center that evening. He looked back at the building that housed so much hope and potential alongside such systematic evil. Tomorrow night, one way or another, the nightmare would end. But first, he had to make sure none of the kids paid the price for his intervention. Saturday evening approached with the weight of reckoning. At 6 o'clock, Mike drove his pickup truck through the industrial district toward Building 47, his heart heavy with anticipation and dread. The concealed recording device felt like a lead weight against his chest, its tiny microphone broadcasting every sound to Detective Carter's surveillance team positioned a quarter-mile away. The warehouse looked abandoned from the outside. Broken windows, rusted loading docks, weeds growing through cracked asphalt. But as Mike approached the rear entrance, the careful camouflage became apparent. Expensive cars filled a hidden parking area, their license plates representing wealth and power from across the region. Inside, the transformation was staggering. The cavernous space had been converted into a professional fighting venue with multiple rings, medical stations, and tiered seating for several hundred spectators. Video cameras on wheeled platforms suggested this wasn't just live entertainment. It was being broadcast to paying customers worldwide. Mike's blood ran cold as he recognized the systematic nature of the operation. This wasn't some crude underground fight club. It was a sophisticated business enterprise generating millions of dollars from the exploitation of children. The first fights were already underway when Mike found a position near the main ring. What he witnessed made his hands clench into fists despite his need to remain inconspicuous. Teenage fighters, clearly drugged to ensure minimal defensive capability, stumbled through matches against experienced adult opponents. The kids put up just enough resistance to make the contests appear competitive while suffering devastating punishment. These weren't children from Riverside Community Center. They came from similar programs throughout the city. Mike realized Frank's operation was just one tentacle of a much larger network, each community center serving as a recruitment pipeline for this industrial-scale horror. He activated his recording device and began documenting everything. The faces of wealthy spectators placing bets on which child would last longest, the medical staff who treated injuries without reporting them, the handlers who drugged young fighters in preparation for their matches. Near the main ring, Frank Kowalski held court with several well-dressed associates. Their conversation focused on profit margins and expansion plans. "The demand keeps growing," Frank was saying to a man Mike recognized as a city councilman. "We're looking at satellite locations in 3 other cities by spring." Mike had heard enough. He moved toward the exit, pulling out his phone to send the predetermined signal to Carter's team. The text message, "Simply go," would trigger simultaneous raids on this location and 2 other warehouses where similar events were taking place. Within minutes, police sirens wailed in the distance. The warehouse erupted in panic as spotlights flooded through the windows and federal agents stormed through multiple entrances. In the chaos, Mike helped 3 barely conscious teenagers reach the medical personnel who accompanied the raid team. Frank Kowalski was arrested without resistance, his hands cuffed behind his back as cameras documented every moment. Brick disappeared in the crowd, but was apprehended trying to escape through a loading dock. Dawn broke over the warehouse district. Mike stood among the wreckage of an empire built on child suffering, finally believing justice had been served. Sunday morning brought vindication in ways Mike had never imagined. News vans surrounded Riverside Community Center as reporters competed to tell the story of the janitor who exposed a multi-million-dollar child trafficking operation. Mike found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never sought, fielding questions from journalists who wanted to know how a maintenance worker had single-handedly brought down such a sophisticated criminal network. "I just did what anyone would do," Mike told Channel 7's morning anchor, deflecting attention from his own role toward the real victims. These kids deserved better. They all deserved better. The media coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Mike was portrayed as an unlikely hero who'd risked everything to save children, while Frank Kowalski was painted as the worst kind of predator, a wealthy man who'd used his position to exploit the most vulnerable members of society. By noon, donations were pouring in from across the country. The community center's phone rang constantly with offers of support from boxing gyms, youth organizations, and private citizens who wanted to help rebuild the programs. A GoFundMe campaign reached $50,000 within hours of being established. Local politicians lined up to be photographed at the center, making speeches about protecting children and supporting community programs. The mayor announced a comprehensive review of all youth sports facilities to ensure proper oversight and prevent similar abuses. Danny and the other kids were treated like celebrities, their stories of survival inspiring people nationwide. Television producers called about documentary deals, while boxing promoters offered scholarships and training opportunities to the legitimate prospects who'd been caught in Frank's web. "This is amazing," Danny told Mike as they watched the news coverage together. "Everyone wants to help now. The gym's gonna be better than ever." Mike smiled, but something nagged at him about how perfectly everything was falling into place. In his experience, justice rarely came this easily or completely. Powerful men like Frank Kowalski didn't go down without using every resource at their disposal. That concern proved prophetic when Detective Carter called Tuesday morning with devastating news. "Mike, we got problems." Carter's voice was tight with frustration. Frank's lawyers found procedural errors in the arrest warrant. Some technicality about probable cause and unlawful surveillance. Most of the charges have been dismissed. "What about the evidence? The recordings, the financial records?" "Inadmissible. His connections run deeper than we thought." He's got allies in the prosecutor's office who've been protecting his operations for years. The federal case is stalling too. Missing evidence, procedural violations, witnesses suddenly changing their stories. Mike stared out the community center window at Danny practicing combinations on a heavy bag, the boy's face glowing with hope and determination. How long before he's back on the street? He made bail an hour ago, Carter replied quietly. Mike, you need to be careful. Men like Frank don't forget, and they don't forgive. As if summoned by their conversation, Mike noticed a familiar black Escalade parked across the street. Frank Kowalski sat in the passenger seat, his cold eyes fixed on the community center's entrance. The media had moved on to other stories. The donations had slowed to a trickle. The politicians had returned to their offices, and the wolf was back, hungrier than ever. Tuesday afternoon arrived with an ominous stillness that made Mike's skin crawl. He arrived at the community center to find the front windows spider-webbed, with cracks and obscene graffiti spray painted across the entrance. Someone had taken a crowbar to the door locks, leaving gouges in the metal that spoke of professional vandalism rather than random mischief. Inside, the damage was systematic and devastating. Every piece of training equipment had been destroyed. With surgical precision, heavy bags slashed open and emptying sand across the floor, speed bags cut from their moorings, boxing gloves shredded beyond repair. The ring itself had been vandalized with spray paint, its canvas slashed in long, deliberate cuts, but nothing had been stolen. This wasn't theft, it was a message. Tommy Sullivan stood amid the wreckage, his weathered face showing every one of his 67 years. They came sometime after midnight, he said, his voice hollow with defeat. Professional job. Cut the phone lines first, disabled the alarm system. Police say there's no evidence, no witnesses. Mike surveyed the destruction, his jaw tightening as he recognized the psychological warfare behind it. Frank wasn't just attacking property, he was attacking hope itself. Parents have been calling all morning, Tommy continued. Half of them are pulling their kids from the program. Can't say I blame them. Word is getting around that we're not safe anymore. By afternoon, the trickle of withdrawals had become a flood. Marcus Chin's parents arrived to collect his gear, followed by Joey's grandmother, then Lisa's foster mother. Each departure felt like a small death, taking with it months of progress and years of dreams. Danny's mother, Elena, wheeled herself through the damaged entrance just as Mike was boarding up the broken windows. Her face showed the strain of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Danny's not coming back, she said quietly, not meeting Mike's eyes. I can't risk it. I'm sorry. Mike understood. Elena Martinez had lost too much already. Her career, her mobility, her husband. She couldn't gamble her son's safety on the hope that justice might eventually prevail. Detective Carter arrived as the sun was setting, his expression grim as he surveyed the vandalism. Same story everywhere Frank's people hit, he reported. No evidence, no witnesses, perfect execution. His lawyers are already claiming harassment, saying we're conducting a vendetta against a legitimate businessman. What about protection for the families? What families? Carter gestured at the empty gym. Everyone's scattered. The kids are in different schools, different neighborhoods. Frank doesn't need to target them anymore. He's already won. The bitter truth settled over Mike like a shroud. Frank's strategy was perfect in its simplicity. Destroy the center's reputation and community support, then watch everything fall apart naturally. No direct threats, no traceable violence, just the inexorable pressure of fear and uncertainty. Wednesday morning brought the final blow. Mike arrived to find official notices posted on the doors. The community center had lost its insurance coverage and city permits due to safety violations discovered during an emergency inspection. The building was condemned pending extensive renovations that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Tommy handed over his keys with shaking hands. Frank's connections go all the way to the mayor's office, he said. They've made it clear. You leave town immediately, and they'll restore the permits and insurance. The center can reopen next month with new management. As Mike stood before the locked doors, reading the official condemnation notice, Rick Kowalski emerged from the black Escalade parked across the street. He approached with the confident swagger of someone who knew he'd already won. Shame about the center, Brick said, his smile carrying no warmth. But my father's got one final offer. A private exhibition match, just you and me, no witnesses. Except family. You win, everything gets restored. You lose or refuse to fight. Brick pulled out his phone, showing Mike surveillance photos of Danny walking to school, Elena at her medical appointments, Tommy visiting his daughter's family. Tomorrow's after-school session would be really tragic if there was a fire. Brick continued conversationally. Old buildings, faulty wiring, kids trapped inside. These things happen. Mike stared at the photos, understanding the complete scope of Frank's plan. This had never been about the community center or even the underground fights. It was about proving that some people were untouchable, that justice was an illusion for those without money and connections. Friday night, Brick said, Riverside, warehouse, just like old times, except this time nobody's coming to save you. As the Escalade drove away, Mike stood alone in the empty parking lot, knowing he was walking into a trap but seeing no other choice. Sometimes the hardest fights weren't about winning. They were about making sure the right people survived. Wednesday morning descended on Mike like a final judgment. He drove through streets that felt foreign now, past the boarded-up community center toward an uncertain future that held only one terrible certainty. The Riverside warehouse district looked different in daylight, smaller, more industrial, less like the scene of future legends and more like what it really was, a graveyard. For broken dreams, Frank Kowalski's terms were simple and absolute. Friday night, 10 o'clock, the same warehouse where the underground fights had taken place. No rules, no referee, no medical support. The fight would continue until one man couldn't continue. Mike had spent 2 days trying to find alternatives. Detective Carter's hands were tied by bureaucracy and corruption. The FBI's investigation had stalled in legal quicksand. The media had moved on to fresher scandals. The community that had rallied so passionately just days ago had scattered like leaves before Frank's systematic campaign of intimidation. At T57, facing a professional MMA fighter in his prime, the odds were mathematically impossible. Brick was younger, stronger, better conditioned, and would be fighting on his father's terms in a venue designed to favor him. This wasn't David versus Goliath. This was execution disguised as competition. But the alternative was unthinkable. Mike had seen the surveillance photos. Danny walking to his new school alone, unaware of the eyes watching from parked cars. Elena, at her physical therapy appointments, vulnerable in her wheelchair. Tommy's granddaughter playing in her backyard, innocent of the dangers her grandfather's association with Mike had brought into her life. Frank's message was clear: refuse the fight. And these people would suffer consequences that made the warehouse burn seem merciful. Thursday evening, Mike sat in his apartment reviewing the video Danny had sent him. The boy practicing combinations in his bedroom, using the techniques Mike had taught him during their brief time together. The message that accompanied it was simple: thank you for everything, coach. Hope I get to train with you again someday. Mike closed his laptop and walked to his bedroom closet, retrieving a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay his championship mouthguard, the same one he'd worn during his greatest victories and most devastating defeats. Tomorrow, it would protect him one final time. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Change of plans. Warehouse basement. More private. Hope you're ready for an education. Mike understood the modification's purpose. The basement would be soundproof, invisible to any surveillance, perfect for an execution that would never be investigated. Frank wasn't just eliminating a threat. He was sending a message to anyone else who might consider challenging his authority. As midnight approached, Mike made his final preparations. He recorded a video message for Elena Martinez, explaining his choice and asking her to help the other families stay connected. He wrote a letter to Detective Carter, providing details about Frank's broader network that might help future investigations. Finally, he placed a call to Tommy Sullivan. Mike, Tommy's voice was heavy with exhaustion and guilt. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. Been looking for another way for 3 days? Mike replied. Sometimes there isn't one. Sometimes you just have to stand up and take what comes. The kids, they'll never forget what you did for them. Mike smiled in the darkness. That's the point, Tommy. They'll remember that someone stood up when it mattered. Maybe that'll make them stronger when their time comes. Friday morning, Mike woke before dawn and drove to the abandoned warehouse one final time. In 12 hours, he would face Brick Kowalski in a fight he probably couldn't win, for stakes that made victory irrelevant. But as he stood in the empty parking lot watching the sun rise over the industrial district, Mike Tyson felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with his choices. The hardest fights weren't about winning. They were about proving that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the outcome. Friday morning arrived with the weight of finality. Mike unlocked the community center's side entrance at 6 a.m., using keys Tommy had given him for this final session. The main building remained condemned, but the small training room adjacent to the office was still accessible, a forgotten space where equipment had been stored during better times. Danny was waiting in the parking lot, along with Marcus, Joey, and Lisa. Somehow, they learned about Mike's situation and refused to let him face it alone. Their presence filled him with both pride and heartbreak. These kids had absorbed lessons about loyalty and courage that would serve them far beyond any boxing gym. "You don't have to be here," Mike told them as he unlocked the door. "Yeah, we do," Danny replied simply. "You taught us that sometimes you stand up even when you can't win." For the next 3 hours, Mike conducted the most important training session of his life. But instead of teaching combinations or footwork, he focused on lessons that would matter long after tonight's fight was over. "Strength isn't about how hard you can hit," he explained, demonstrating a defensive sequence with Danny. "It's about getting back up when life knocks you down. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves." He shared stories carefully chosen for their lessons rather than their glory. Defeats that taught humility, victories that came from helping others, moments when walking away took more courage than fighting. "My biggest regret isn't any fight I lost," Mike told them as they sat in a circle on the gym mats. "It's the times I had strength and didn't use it to help people who needed help." He removed his championship mouthguard, the one that had protected him through decades of battles, and handed it to Danny. "This isn't about boxing anymore," he said quietly. "It's about remembering that someone believed in you enough to fight for you." Danny's eyes filled with tears as he accepted the piece of boxing history. "Coach, you don't have to do this. We can call the police, or sometimes the police can't fix everything," Mike interrupted gently. "Sometimes regular people have to stand up and do what's right, even when it's scary." As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Mike made them promise to stick together, to keep training however they could, and to use their strength to protect other kids who might find themselves in similar situations. "What if something happens to you?" Lisa asked, her 13-year-old voice small in the empty room. Mike knelt beside her, his voice steady and sure. "Then you remember that someone thought you were worth fighting for. And someday, when you're strong enough, you do the same thing for someone else." At sunset, Mike locked the center for the final time and walked toward his truck. The kids remained in the parking lot, watching him drive away, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that would shape their lives forever. In his rearview mirror, Mike saw them standing together, 4 young people who would carry forward the lessons he'd taught them, regardless of what happened in the darkness ahead. The Riverside Warehouse District felt like a tomb at 10 o'clock Friday night. Mike's pickup truck rumbled through empty streets lined with abandoned buildings, their broken windows staring down like hollow eyes. The October air carried the smell of rust and decay, industrial ghosts that whispered of better times long past. Building 47 looked different than it had during the underground fights. Gone were the crowds of wealthy spectators and their expensive cars. Tonight, only 3 vehicles occupied the hidden parking area: Frank's black Escalade, a white van with tinted windows, and a motorcycle that probably belonged to one of Frank's enforcers. Mike killed his engine and sat in the truck's cab for a long moment, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. Through the warehouse's loading dock, he could see harsh fluorescent lights casting stark shadows across the concrete floor. This wasn't going to be the professional venue he'd raided days earlier. It was going to be an execution chamber dressed up as a fight. Frank Kowalski emerged from the shadows as Mike approached, flanked by 2 men whose expensive suits couldn't disguise their obvious roles as muscle. The construction magnate's smile held all the warmth of a snake's belly. "Mr. Tyson," Frank said with mock politeness, "so good of you to honor our agreement. I was beginning to think you might lose your nerve." "I'm here," Mike replied simply, his voice carrying the calm of a man who'd made peace with impossible odds. "Excellent. Just to review the terms, no weapons, but everything else is fair game." The fight continues until one man is unconscious or dead. My associates here will ensure there are no interruptions. Mike nodded, studying the basement entrance Frank indicated with a gesture. The concrete stairs disappeared into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. One question, Mike said. After this is over, the kids and their families are safe? Permanently. Frank's laugh was genuinely amused. Mr. Tyson, after tonight, you won't be in any position to worry about anyone's safety. In the basement, the setup was exactly what Mike had expected. A makeshift ring surrounded by concrete walls, no medical equipment, no referee, no rules beyond survival. Brick Kowalski stood in the center of the space, stripped to shorts and hand wraps, his 220 pounds of trained muscle gleaming under the harsh overhead lights at T-28. Brick was in the prime of his athletic life. His cardio was perfect, his technique refined through years of professional training, his confidence absolute. He'd been preparing for this moment since their first encounter, planning exactly how he would dismantle the aging legend who'd humiliated him in front of children. Mike removed his shirt slowly, revealing a body that carried every one of its 57 years. Scars from old battles, the softness that came with age, the inevitable decline that time imposed on even the greatest athletes. But his eyes held something Brick couldn't understand, a calm acceptance that made victory meaningless to AS. The two fighters faced each other in the concrete tomb. Frank called out from the stairs, "Gentlemen, you may begin." In the darkness above, neither man noticed the small shadows moving carefully through the warehouse, or the faint glow of cell phone cameras recording from hidden positions. The first punch Brick threw was designed to end the fight immediately, a looping overhand right that carried every ounce of his strength and conditioning. It was the punch of someone who wanted to make a statement, to crush the legend quickly and decisively. Mike slipped it with liquid grace, his head moving just enough to let the fist whistle past his ear. The movement was so effortless it seemed, almost accidental, until Brick threw another haymaker and Mike avoided it with the same impossible ease. "Come on, old man," Brick snarled, frustration already creeping into his voice. "Stand still and take your medicine." But Mike wasn't fighting like an old man. As muscle memory awakened from decades of dormancy, the years seemed to fall away like discarded clothes. His footwork carried him around the makeshift ring with the fluid precision that had once made him the most feared fighter on earth. For 2 minutes, Mike simply moved, slipping punches, rolling with attempted combinations, occasionally tapping Brick lightly with his gloves. Not hitting, just touching, showing complete control while the younger man grew increasingly wild and desperate. Frank watched from the stairs with growing unease. This wasn't supposed to be competitive, it was supposed to be an execution. But the janitor moving around his son with balletic grace bore no resemblance to the maintenance worker who'd mopped floors for 6 months. Then Brick made his first critical mistake. Angry and embarrassed, he loaded up with a massive right cross, putting every ounce of his strength behind a punch meant to separate Mike's head from his shoulders. Mike saw it coming from the moment Brick's weight shifted. He slipped left, stepped inside the arc of the punch, and drove a short right hand into Brick's solar plexus. A perfect body shot that landed with surgical precision. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, the wet thud of leather meeting flesh, followed immediately by Brick's explosive exhale as every molecule of air left his lungs. He doubled over, gasping, his face rapidly changing color as his diaphragm spasmed. "That's for the broken noses," Mike said quietly, circling like a predator as Brick struggled to breathe. When Brick straightened up, his eyes held real fear for the first time. This wasn't some washed-up has-been. This was Iron Mike Tyson, and, despite his age, the legend still had teeth. Mike moved forward with the inexorable patience of a master craftsman. The combination that followed was pure vintage Tyson. A left uppercut to the body that lifted Brick onto his toes, followed immediately by a right hand to the same spot that dropped him to his knees. Each punch was placed with mathematical precision, designed to maximize damage while maintaining perfect control. Brick knelt on the concrete floor, hands pressed to his midsection, making small gasping sounds as he struggled to process what was happening to him. "That's for the kicks when they were down," Mike continued, his voice carrying the authority of final judgment. From the stairs, Frank's confident expression had transformed into something approaching panic. His son, the professional fighter who was supposed to destroy this aging janitor, was being systematically dismantled by a man old enough to be his father. In the darkness above, small figures moved carefully through the warehouse, their cell phones capturing every moment of the legendary boxer's final stand. By the third round, the warehouse basement had become a furnace. Brick's superior conditioning began to assert itself as Mike's movements, while still precise, carried the inevitable weight of his 57 years. The younger man's breathing remained controlled while Mike's chest rose and fell with increasing effort. Brick recognized the shift and changed his strategy completely. Instead of hunting for the knockout punch that had gotten him in trouble, he began using constant movement and clinching to tire Mike out. Every time the older fighter tried to set his feet for power shots, Brick would grab him, lean on him, make him carry extra weight while landing short shots to the body. "Getting tired, old man?" Brick taunted, landing a sharp elbow during a clinch that opened a cut above Mike's left eye. This is what happens when legends try to live in the past. Mike absorbed the punishment with grim determination, but his reflexes were slowing perceptibly. Punches that would have been easy to slip in the first round now caught him flush. His legs, which had carried him with fluid grace just minutes earlier, were beginning to feel heavy beneath him. By the fourth round, Brick was landing clean shots with increasing frequency. A left hook caught Mike on the temple, staggering him. A right cross snapped his head back, sending blood from his cut eye spattering across the concrete wall. The accumulated damage was beginning to tell, and both fighters knew the momentum had shifted decisively. Frank's confidence returned as he watched his son take control. "Finish him, Brick," he called from the stairs. "Show him what happens to people who don't know their place." But in the darkness above the basement, something extraordinary was happening. Danny, Marcus, Joey, and Lisa had followed Mike to the warehouse, unable to stand by while their mentor faced destruction alone. Using skills learned from a lifetime of staying invisible in dangerous situations, they'd infiltrated the building and positioned themselves to witness the fight. More importantly, Danny had begun live streaming the battle on social media, his phone's camera capturing every moment of Mike Tyson's desperate stand against impossible odds. The video quality was poor, the angles awkward, but the emotional impact was devastating. "This is Mike Tyson fighting for us," Danny whispered into his phone's microphone, tears streaming down his face as he watched his mentor absorb punishment. Fighting for kids nobody else cares about. The livestream began attracting viewers with exponential speed. Boxing fans, alerted by Danny's hashtags, shared the feed across social platforms. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching the legendary heavyweight champion battle for his life in a basement warehouse. By the end of round 5, Mike was badly hurt but still standing. Brick was confident and relatively fresh, sensing victory within his grasp. Frank watched with satisfaction as his plan appeared to reach its inevitable conclusion. Neither of them noticed the growing sound drifting down from the warehouse above, the voices of children chanting a name that had once struck fear into the hearts of heavyweight champions around the world. "Tyson, Tyson, Tyson." In the basement, Mike's head lifted at the sound, and something that had been dimming in his eyes suddenly blazed back to life. The sound of children's voices chanting his name drifted down through the warehouse like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Mike's head lifted at the familiar sound, and something that had been dimming in his eyes suddenly blazed back to life. Above them, in the darkness of the main warehouse floor, Danny's livestream had exploded across social media with viral intensity. "This is Mike Tyson fighting for kids nobody cares about," Danny whispered into his phone, his voice breaking with emotion. "He's getting hurt because he wouldn't let them hurt us anymore." The viewer count climbed exponentially, thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people around the world watching the legendary boxer's desperate last stand. Boxing fans shared the feed frantically, their comments flooding in with disbelief and rage at what they were witnessing. "Someone call the cops. This is Mike fucking Tyson. He's fighting for those kids." Detective Carter's phone buzzed incessantly, with notifications as citizens posted the warehouse's location and demanded police intervention. Within minutes, squad cars were racing through the industrial district, their sirens wailing in the distance in the basement. Frank Kowalski's confidence evaporated as he realized his private execution had become a global spectacle. "Shut it down," he screamed at his associates. "Find those kids and stop the broadcast." But it was too late. The story was already racing across news networks as producers scrambled to understand how Mike Tyson had ended up fighting for his life in an underground warehouse. Police dispatch crackled with urgent communications as units coordinated their approach to the building. Brick heard the sirens too, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to desperate urgency. "We need to finish this now," he snarled, abandoning all technique in favor of wild, powerful punches designed to end the fight before law enforcement arrived. Mike weathered the storm of leather, his defensive instincts still sharp despite his accumulated damage. But more importantly, the sound of those young voices chanting his name had reminded him why he was here. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about proving to four kids that someone would stand up for them when the world turned its back. "Tyson, Tyson, Tyson." The chant grew louder as the live stream reached millions of viewers worldwide. In the basement, Mike straightened his shoulders and stepped forward, no longer fighting just to survive, but fighting to show those children what real strength looked like. Frank's face had gone pale as he understood the full scope of his miscalculation. His quiet elimination of a troublesome janitor had become an international incident that would destroy everything he'd built. Police sirens grew louder, and the children's voices echoed through the warehouse. Mike Tyson prepared for one final round, not as a fading legend trying to reclaim past glory, but as a protector proving that some things were worth any sacrifice. The world was watching. The children were believing. And Iron Mike had one more miracle left in his aging fists. The final round began with both fighters understanding this was their last chance. Police sirens wailed just blocks away, growing closer with each passing second. Brick came forward with desperate aggression, throwing wild combinations born of panic rather than technique. He knew his father's empire was collapsing around them, and only Mike's defeat could salvage anything from the wreckage. Mike weaved through the barrage of punches. With the fluid grace of a master craftsman, his movements economical and precise despite his accumulated damage. The sound of children chanting his name had transformed him, burning away the fatigue and pain that had been dragging him down. This wasn't about surviving anymore. This was about legacy. "Stand still and die, old man." Brick screamed, throwing a massive overhand right that carried all his remaining strength. It was the same punch that had gotten him in trouble in the first round. Telegraphed, overcommit, and fatally slow. Mike had seen it 1,000 times in his career, thrown by desperate fighters who'd abandoned technique for raw power. He slipped the punch with liquid precision, stepped inside Brick's guard, and drove his legendary right hand upward in a perfect uppercut that caught the younger man flush on the chin. The punch carried 5 decades of accumulated skill, launched from legs that still remembered how to generate devastating power, guided by hands that had once been the most feared weapons in heavyweight boxing. The impact sounded like a gunshot. In the concrete basement, Brick's head snapped back violently, his eyes rolling white as his brain registered the devastating trauma. For a moment, he stood frozen like a statue, then crashed to the concrete floor with the finality of a felled tree. Mike stood over his fallen opponent, breathing hard but victorious, as the warehouse above erupted with the sounds of police intervention. Footsteps thundered across the main floor while officers shouted commands and coordinated their sweep of the building. Frank Kowalski tried to flee up the basement stairs, but ran directly into Detective Carter, who'd been following the livestream coordinates. "Frank Kowalski, you're under arrest," Carter announced, his voice carrying grim satisfaction as handcuffs clicked around the construction magnate's wrists. In the basement, paramedics rushed to treat both fighters. Brick was unconscious but breathing, his pulse strong despite the devastating knockout. Mike sat against the concrete wall, accepting medical attention while maintaining his focus on the unconscious form of his opponent. "Is he going to be okay?" Mike asked the paramedic checking Brick's vitals. "Severe concussion, but he'll live," came the professional assessment. "Might have some memory issues, but nothing permanent." As they loaded both fighters onto gurneys, Mike caught sight of Danny and the other kids being led to safety by police officers. The boy held up his phone triumphantly, showing Mike that the live stream was still broadcasting to millions of viewers worldwide. Detective Carter approached Mike's gurney as paramedics prepared to transport him to the hospital. The whole network's blown up, he reported with satisfaction. Federal agents are hitting locations in 6 cities based on intelligence from Frank's files. This time, the charges are going to stick. Mike nodded weakly, then looked up at the camera still broadcasting his words to the world. No one touches these kids. As sirens wailed through the night and justice finally descended on Frank Kowalski's empire, Mike Tyson closed his eyes and smiled. Some fights were about winning. This one had been about proving that legends never truly fade. They just wait for the right moment to remind the world what real strength looks like. Mike woke up in Metropolitan General Hospital to find his room filled with flowers, balloons, and cards from around the world. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and for a moment, he couldn't remember why his ribs ached and his left eye was swollen shut. Then Detective Carter's face appeared beside his bed, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd finally seen justice served. "How long was I out?" Mike asked, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. 18 hours, Carter replied. "Doctors wanted to keep you sedated while they checked for internal bleeding. Good news is you're tougher than a $2 steak, no permanent damage." Through the hospital window, Mike could see news vans lining the street below. Carter followed his gaze and chuckled. "Your front-page news in 47 countries. The footage Danny shot went viral beyond anything I've ever seen. Every major network wants an interview." "What about Frank and Brick?" Carter's expression hardened with professional satisfaction. "Frank's looking at federal charges that'll put him away for the rest of his natural life." The raid netted operations in 6 cities, over 200 arrests, including judges, city officials, and police commanders. Brick's facing 20 to life for his role in the trafficking ring. And the kids? Safe. All of them. Your little stunt made it impossible for anyone to retaliate. Too much international attention, too many people watching. Carter pulled up a chair. "Matter of fact, Danny's become something of a celebrity himself. Kids been giving interviews about what you taught them, how you stood up when nobody else would." As if summoned by their conversation, the hospital room door opened to reveal Elena Martinez in her wheelchair, followed by Danny, Marcus, Joey, and Lisa. Their faces glowed with relief and gratitude as they surrounded Mike's bed. "Coach," Danny said, his voice thick with emotion. "You scared us." "Sorry about that," Mike replied, accepting the championship mouthguard Danny returned to him. "But sometimes you've got to scare people to wake them up." Elena wheeled closer, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Tyson, I don't know how to thank you. What you did for our children, they did it for themselves," Mike interrupted gently. "I just showed them they were worth fighting for." Over the next hour, a parade of visitors filled the room. Tommy Sullivan arrived with blueprints for the rebuilt community center, his eyes bright with possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. Detective Carter returned with news that the mayor's office had fast-tracked funding for youth programs throughout the city. Representatives from boxing organizations offered sponsorships and training opportunities for the kids, but the most meaningful moment came when Lisa, the smallest of his students, approached his bedside with a handmade card. Inside, in careful 13-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "Thank you for teaching us that real strength comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves." As evening fell and the visitors gradually departed, Mike found himself alone with Danny and Elena. The boy sat quietly beside his mother's wheelchair, both of them struggling to express what Mike's sacrifice had meant to their family. "The doctors say you could have died," Elena said finally. "Why did you risk everything for kids you barely knew?" Mike considered the question, watching the lights of the city twinkle beyond his hospital window. "Because someone did it for me once," he replied. "And because those kids deserve to know that somebody thought they were worth fighting for." Outside his room, the world continued to buzz with the story of the janitor who'd turned out to be a legend, the children who'd believed in him, and the fight that had reminded everyone what real heroism looked like. 6 months later, Mike arrived at the newly rebuilt Riverside Community Center to find Danny and a dozen other kids already warming up in the pristine training facility. Sunlight streamed through new windows, illuminating equipment donated by boxing organizations from around the world. The walls displayed photos from the center's history, including a prominent picture of Mike standing over the fallen brick Kowalski, with the caption, "Some heroes mop floors until the world needs them to fight." The transformation was remarkable. What had once been a cramped, underfunded afterthought was now a state-of-the-art facility that served as a model for youth programs nationwide. Donations had poured in from every corner of the globe, inspired by the viral footage of 4 children, believing in their mentor enough to risk everything for him. "Morning, Coach," Danny called out, his voice carrying new confidence and authority. At 15, he'd grown 4 inches and gained 30 pounds of muscle, but more importantly, he'd developed the quiet leadership that marked true champions. His first amateur bout was scheduled for next weekend, and college scouts were already expressing interest. Mike smiled, settling behind the desk in his office, a real office now, with his name on the door and certificates on the walls recognizing his contributions to youth development. Through the window, he could see Elena Martinez coordinating family services from her new position as the center's community liaison. Her recovery had accelerated dramatically once proper medical care became available, and she'd discovered a talent for helping other struggling families navigate the system. The morning training session proceeded with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Danny worked with the newest kids, teaching them the fundamentals Mike had shown him months ago. Marcus was preparing for Golden Gloves competition while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. Joey had discovered a talent for boxing journalism and was documenting the center's programs for a national magazine. Lisa, now 14, was developing into a formidable lightweight with professional potential. "Coach," Danny approached as the session ended, "there's a kid outside. Says he needs help." Mike looked through the window to see a small boy sitting alone on the steps, his clothes torn and his face showing the hollow look of someone who'd learned too early that the world could be cruel. The sight transported Mike back to his own childhood, to the moment when someone had first shown him that strength could be used to protect rather than destroy. "What's his name?" Mike asked. "Carlos. He's 11. Says his older brother's been making him fight other kids for money." Mike nodded, understanding immediately. Frank Kowalski's network was gone, but poverty and desperation created new predators every day. The work would never be finished, but that didn't make it less important. "Bring him in," Mike said. "Let's see what we can teach him." As Danny led the new boy inside, Mike reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he'd been hiding from his past, content to remain invisible while children suffered around him. Now he was exactly where he belonged, not as a forgotten champion living on faded glory, but as a mentor helping the next generation discover their own strength. Tommy Sullivan appeared in the doorway, his weathered face showing the contentment of a man who'd found redemption in service to others. "Good session today," he observed. "Kids are really responding to the new program structure." Mike glanced around the bustling gym, watching kids of all ages learning not just boxing techniques, but life skills that would serve them far beyond any ring. Some would become champions, others would find different paths, but all of them would remember that someone had believed they were worth fighting for. The final image was of Mike's championship mouthguard, now worn by Danny as he demonstrated proper defensive technique to young Carlos. The boy watched with rapt attention, absorbing lessons about courage, technique, and the responsibility that came with strength. Sometimes the hardest fights weren't about winning. They were about proving that some things were worth any sacrifice. And that true legends never fade when they're fighting for the right reasons. That if you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.